I'm Stan Altman. I'm Dean of the School of Public Affairs. Let me welcome you to this evening's Ackerman Lecture. The School of Public Affairs, for those of you who are not familiar with Baruch College, is one of three schools. The Zicklin School of Business and the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences and the School of Public Affairs make up the academic activities of the Baruch College. And we describe ourselves as a college devoted to the professional development of a wide array of students. If you look at the composition of our student body, they come from over 150 countries from around the world. They speak over 92 different languages. And 1 out of every 3 of them speaks a different language than English at home. Baruch is rated as the most diverse undergraduate college in the United States. So we have a unique challenge as a college, and being part of the City University, we have a heritage about being the bridge between first and second generation who want to find a way into the American dream and do it through, as we often say, through getting an education in college. And so the City University's mission is to provide this bridge, to in fact provide access to people who would normally not be able to afford a college education because of either economic means or because, having been a first and second generation, are just not familiar with the normal ways in which you can access all of the aspects of our society. That's why the existence and the creation of the Ackerman Lecture Series and the Ackerman Chair in Equality and Social Justice was an event that the college and the School of Public Affairs was quite proud when it occurred over a year and a half ago. And I think we kind of celebrate this issue of equality and our mission and commitment to providing access to all members of our society through the series of lectures that we hold. And part of the series and part of this moment is to acknowledge the generosity of the Engelman family, who in fact created this chair. And part of the formalities and, I guess, informalities of the way we run this lecture series is to share with this family this moment. And so it's my distinguished pleasure to introduce Mrs. Rosalind Engelman, who will, in fact, take a few moments to tell us about the history and the reason for the chair being named after her family. Rosalind.
It's my pleasure to greet you. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Yes? It's my pleasure to greet you this evening. I wish to express my family's gratitude to Dean Altman, whose hard work and vision made the Ackerman Lecture Series far surpass my family's hopes. Many of the students at Baruch, as was mentioned, come from another country. Lily and Nathan Ackerman, my parents, came to this country to escape oppression, economic hardship, and religious persecution, as so many of the students here have done. There were 2 things in which they believed deeply. One was this country, and the other was education. My mother often wrote senators, congressmen, the president, and gave her opinion on legislation before Congress and the weighty issues of the day. And moreover, she got answers. I had the feeling if she didn't get an answer, she'd be at the White House. Until she was 90, she always voted. And she would say to me, "My child, you cannot appreciate this country as I do because you were born here." When the students of Baruch graduate, it's our hope they won't forget who they are where they came from, the hardships they endured, and the school Baruch. It's education at Baruch, my husband's alma mater, which make all things possible. It's my privilege, and a great one, to introduce you to Professor Marcellus Andrews. I've come to know him. He's congenial, he's funny, he's a cook, and he's brilliant. Marcellus has made the symposia meaningful and exciting, and his plans are truly inspirational. Professor Andrews' ideals and his life's work exemplify the quest for equality and justice. I'd just like to quickly skim his many achievements and attributes. You know he's the visiting associate professor of the Ackerman Chair for Equality and Justice here at the School for Public Affairs at Baruch College. Professor Andrews is on leave from Wellesley College and has been a visiting fellow at the Institute on Race and Social Division at Boston University. He received a bachelor's degree in business administration from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in economics from Yale University. Andrews, well, there are so many books. You have to take my word that he authored a great many. And so without the long list, I will now introduce Professor Andrews.
I would like to tell you about our speaker tonight, Glenn Cartman Lowry. Glenn Lowry is currently a university professor, professor of economics, and the director of the Institute on Race and Social Division at Boston University. He has taught economics previously at Harvard, at Northwestern, and at the University of Michigan. He holds a BA in mathematics from Northwestern and a PhD in economics from MIT. It is not too much to say that Glenn Lowry is one of the most distinguished economic theorists of the day. He has scholarly articles in welfare economics, game theory, industrial organization, national resource economics, and the economics of income distribution. He's presented his research at innumerable conferences. He's published in the leading journals. He has been a scholar in residence at Oxford, at Tel Aviv University, at the University of Stockholm, at the Delhi School of Economics, and at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He's recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for his work. He has served on advisory commissions, including the National Academy of Sciences. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society and was elected vice president of the lead association of economics in this country, the American Economic Association, in 1997. Professor Lowry, Glenn Lowry, is a prominent social critic and a leading public intellectual in addition to being a superb economic theorist. He's written on race and inequality and social policy in dozens of influential magazines and publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Commentary Magazine, and the National Review. He is a contributing editor to the New Republic and a member of the Publication Committee of the Public Interest. He has been a frequent commentator on radio and television, national radio and television. He is a sought-after public speaker and a brilliant one, as you will see shortly. His most recent book, One by One from the Inside Out, Essays and Reviews on Race and Responsibility in America, won the American Book Award in 1996 and the Christianity Today Book Award in 1996 as well. He was chosen by his colleagues at Boston University for the prestigious university lecture, a lecture I had the good grace to attend in the academic year 1996 and 1997. Before Glenn comes to speak with you about a most important issue of the day, I would simply like to tell you why Glenn Lowry matters and why he's been invited to be the second Ackerman lecturer. I've said he's a renowned economic theorist, and indeed he is. But one of the things Glenn Loury did was take some of the most complex and important economic theory, the analysis of information and incentives and the economic outcomes that come from market economies that don't function perfectly, and apply these powerful analytical tools that he helped develop, and he was trained in at MIT, to questions of race and economic inequality. In doing that, Glenn has created a way of thinking that has been a challenge to all of us. Much of his work, though not all of it, has considered, using analytical economics, considered the logic and limits of civil rights and anti-discrimination policies in economies characterized by imperfect information. In order to deal appropriately with questions of inequality and intergenerational transmission of poverty, Glenn Loury created an entire idea called social capital. There is indeed a great apocryphal myth, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, actually, apocryphal story about social capital and how all the rest of us who ever went to graduate school after Loury were trying to do the same thing and failed and hate him for it. Glenn's work, particularly in early work out of his dissertation, a paper called A Dynamic Theory of Racial Income Differences, and a subsequent paper in 1981 called Intergenerational Transfers and the Distribution of Earnings. This work is the basis for an entire raft, 20 years of work in macroeconomics, studying income distribution, the dynamics of inequality, the process of economic growth, by paying attention to how families function. Work that has inspired other work in economics, in public finance, and development economics, and of course the question of economic justice. Glenn, though, matters to me and to a whole generation of black economists and black social thinkers for a very different reason. Glenn Loury almost single-handedly, to our minds, reconstructed and made valid a conservative stance in matters of race. It is not that we were conservative. Indeed, most of the people I have in mind were anti-conservative. But it was easy to dismiss American conservatives as, frankly, intellectual trash until Loury combined rigorous economics and a deep commitment to the lives of poor people to fashion a conservative argument about the logic and limits of compensatory justice, and in that way posed a challenge to all of us. It was an analytically powerful revision of the doctrine of self-help among black people and provided a powerful intellectual counterpoint to the black liberalism as rooted in American social democracy. It became the basis for an important protest against the clientism that was then seen as developing between the black masses and elites who staffed social democratic institutions. Indeed, it's fair to say that Glenn Loury has lived up to Marshall's dictum that an economist ought to be wary when everybody is clapping. Loury has always managed to stay ahead of the crowd. And while many of us fussed at him endlessly, hated him gloriously, that was no substitute to coming up with an answer. But Glenn Loury, being a critical intellectual, kept moving, even when American conservatives disgraced themselves by their embrace of the bell curve, by their embrace, of Dinesh D'Souza-esque nonsense. Loury moved forward as American conservatives threw their legitimacy into the intellectual toilet. Loury kept moving and asked the following question as he continued to rewrite American conservatism and to hold out a hope for it. He said, how do you create a just society in a free market context that is open to all while at the same time facing up to the nation's foundational racial crime? How do you do that? How do you do that? He's working on that answer. Part of that answer, of course, is the development of the Institute of Race and Social Division at Boston University. an institute where there is outstanding, amazing, startling thinking going on, where people of all ideological persuasions are welcome so long as they do two things: tell the truth, play by rigorous intellectual rules. Indeed, it is precisely because of the work being done in Boston that I asked him, and he graciously agreed to come talk with us today, to share some of the work happening in Boston, to speak to New York City, the site of the racial crisis, where not enough of this thinking is happening. It's peculiar that it happens in Boston, but not here, but now here it is. Hopefully some of it will stay with us, and we'll get to work too. But Glenn Loury has done something else. His recent work is on social justice in a divided society, and economists come face to face with the questions that economists sometimes love to duck. Thinking about efficiency rather than justice is so easy. The really smart economist knows that just because you can expand the size of the social pie doesn't mean that there will be enough to go around, and even if there is, that's not the end of justice. It may well just be the beginning. And so, without further ado, I give you Glenn Cartman Loury.
Well, what can I say after that introduction? I can thank my friend and colleague Marcellus Andrews for that overly generous and very long introduction, for which I am grateful, and only pray that I will be able to live up to it. And thanks as well to the Engelman family for the gift that has endowed this lecture series. I'm very proud to be a Lillian Nathan Ackerman lecturer this year, and also very glad to be in this institution about which I know too little. And a very impressive institution from what I've been able to see of it, doing important work in this city. All right, now I'm going to challenge you this evening, and that's not to presume that I know what you think, but there's so much in this long lecture that is that has made so many people upset with me that it would be astounding if you weren't challenged by it. My grandmother used to say something: "My mouth ain't no prayer book," by which she meant that she was not infallible, and neither am I, by which she meant to say she was still trying, even at an advanced age, to learn about life, and so am I. So I welcome colloquy. I don't want to discourage you from telling me where you think I've gone wrong or what I've left out. I know I'm in a city of immigrants. This has been emphasized with respect to this institution. And some of what I'm going to have to say here will be in the spirit of holding up before you what I'm just going to call black exceptionalism. I'm going to be talking about what is different about the experience of African Americans relative to other Americans, and that's sensitive ground. That's touchy stuff. I want you to know, when I turn to my text and present this argument, that I don't enter there lightly. I don't take it up ill-considered. I'm not here to grind an axe, to point a finger, or to give a harangue. Right? Nor am I here as an ethnic cheerleader, advocating for the interest of my people over some other people, wanting to edge our way a little bit further up in the queue. I'm here to argue for my people, all right, the American people. I'm here to say what I have to say on behalf of saving, if you like, the soul of my nation, not just the interests of my ethnic group. But I read American history, and I see the contemporary socio-political landscape as one in which, in order to do the former, advocate for the soul of my people, it's necessary for me to do the latter, call attention to the exceptional circumstances of those who descend from African slaves. That's what I'm going to be about. This is a large argument that I'm going to try to put before you, so let me just tell you in brief compass right now what the framework is, what's the lay of the land. I'm going to introduce the subject, racial justice. I'm going to lay down 3 axioms that will be the analytical foundation for the argument in respect to that subject. The first axiom will deal with the matter of race itself. What is it that I'm talking about there? What is race? Is there any such thing? Is that just a fiction? One analyst has called it belief in race a bit like belief in witches. Mischievous nonsense and nothing more. There are no witches, we know that, and there are no races, it is said. I'm going to take issue with that, and I'm going to put forward why it is that I would direct something called the Institute on Race and Social Division. I just have to tell you this story. Some of you know who Stanley Crouch is. He's an interesting and important guy, I think, in his way. Stanley calls me up after he gets a brochure from the newly founded Institute on Race and Social Division, and he says in that raspy voice of his that I can't imitate, "Man, don't you know that race is over?" Not the race is over. You say, race is over, man. You see, race is over. Race is a part of our past. It's a skeleton in the closet. We've moved on. Well, I wish that it were so. Would that it were so. Would that it were so. Seems to me not to be the case. I need to tell you what it is that I'm talking about when I talk about race. So that's the first piece. I'm going to be discussing here the question of whether or not there are essential differences between human population subgroups defined by race that could give an account, an explanation, a causal account for protracted differences in the status, the economic achievement, the social position of those population groups. I'm going to reject that position. I'm going to call that anti-essentialism. Let me be clear. I know that there are differences in the proclivity with which people may contract hypertension or Tay-Sachs syndrome or whatever it might be. I'm not unaware of the fact that there is, variability across population subgroups in a number of biological and environment biological interacting processes that one might point to. But at the deeper level, when we talk about really profound differences in social position, I want to hold that both as an empirical, but also as a principled position, we ought to go forward on the assumption that we are pretty much all alike. I don't mean everybody is as smart as everybody else, but I mean the populations that we talk about, the aggregates of millions of people, do not differ in any deep and profound ways that could give an account for what are obviously deep and profound differences in their social positions. Anti-essentialism. Finally, I'm going to talk about racial stigma. Stigma, sociological notion, a mark, stigmata, a blot, a visible marring of the person. Okay, this is not economics. Maybe it's sociology. I don't know what, anthropology, I don't know. But I'm going to talk about it because it's critical to my case for the exceptionalism of the African American population within the larger polyglot American social cauldron. Okay. So after the introduction, I'm going to go on to expand a little bit on those three analytical pillars for the larger argument that I want to make. That's going to take altogether, to get those ideas across, about half of the time that I'm going to spend here. The second half of the time, I'm going to take this foundation, I'm going to apply it to a normative analysis of the question of racial justice. And there, my question is simply going to be the following. If you go up to a conservative or a liberal, for that matter, and you say, have you been to a public hospital waiting room recently and seen the people who are on queue there to get health care? The ones who don't have any insurance, you know. Have you been to a welfare office lately and seen the folks with their children in tow who are there trying to get the handout from the state? The ones who don't have enough money to live on, don't have any jobs, don't have any husbands with 3, 4 kids, no decent place to live? Have you been to a courthouse and observed the proceedings of American justice? I don't put the word in quotes. The justice that's meted out at the retail level. And seen the folks begging for mercy for their son or daughter who's about to be sent off, but which mercy is not permitted under the mandatory sentencing statutes that the judge is constrained by. And if you visit these places, have you noticed that what you see there is not a random draw on the American population, but what you see there is a raced subset of the American population, disproportionately so. Not only African Americans, to be sure, but vastly disproportionately so. Here we are, 7 generations past the end of slavery, entering into the 21st century. A different nation now than we were in 1960, and certainly a different nation than we were in 1930. And yet, that's still the case. Yes, I know there's a black middle class. Yes, I'm aware of the fact that there have been changes in American society since 1964, 1954. I know that. Nevertheless, I would say, have you been to these places? Now, you ask that to many a conservative and many a liberal, and they will say, yeah, I've seen that. So what? Okay, I've seen the racial disparity that you talk about. So what? If there are Americans who need health care, they're Americans. What difference does it make what color they are? If they're on queue at the hospital, then that's Americans on queue. And if their children don't have enough to eat, well, maybe we need to reform the welfare laws or whatever, but race hasn't got anything to do with it. Unless you tell me that somebody's been discriminated against, unless you show me where by race they didn't have the same opportunity because of race. But we know that that's not true because everything has changed since 1954 and 1964 and so forth. What has race got to do with it? So when I talk about racial justice, I obviously bear the burden of saying race has got something to do with it. And this is the bottom line of the argument that I want to make here today. Race has got something to do with it. It is not an oxymoron or a logical contradiction or an irrelevant juxtaposition of 2 different words to say race and justice in the same phrase. Race has got something to do with it. There is a mandate, quite apart from the social democratic mandate that a decent society makes provision for those who are disadvantaged, there's a mandate that is bequeathed to us by our peculiar history as Americans. And this will be very important to me. I take historical narrative seriously. I take very seriously what's the story, what's the account, what are we about as a nation? Here's a civic enterprise, 250 million people striving. For what? Who are we? Where are we going? From whence have we come? What's the story? Okay? Now, race, if I've got anything to say about it, is going to be a part of that story. Unfinished business, people. Unfinished business on the racial front. We ain't finished yet. Got work to do. It's not yet done. Now, can it be swept under the rug? Yes. Are we capable of moving on? Absolutely. Absolutely. It is quite possible, I think, much to the shame of this great nation, that we might persuade ourselves that there's no problem here. All we're talking about is a few million laggards, right? Threatening, low test scores, bad behavior, land of opportunity. Look at that escalator of mobility moving up. Folks getting off the boat and they're getting on the escalator. These people, well, what can we say? It is quite possible that that could become our story, I say, to our everlasting shame. If I've got anything to do with it, that won't be the story. So that's what I'm about. The lecture. Racial justice. Now, it'd be nice if it were possible to avoid a philosopher's quibble here. Race, justice. Put those 2 words together. It's bound to raise hackles. Why, some will ask, should justice be raced? Mustn't justice be colorblind? I expect to be challenged on this. Indeed, I already have been challenged by some of my distinguished colleagues with whom I've had some discussions in preparing to give this and related lectures. I've considered alternatives. Justice in matters of race, racial equity, etc. But in the end, it has seemed best not to mince words for the sake of avoiding a fight. Indeed, upon reflection, I've come rather to welcome the fight because it forces the key issues out into the open. Indeed, if I can't defend my use of these words in this way, I will have failed in my ambition here, which is nothing less than to develop a new conceptual framework through which we Americans might view the fact of entrenched racial inequality more clearly and with greater humanity. So the enterprise, as I've said, that I'm about to undertake is grounded in 3 interrelated axioms about race and inequality in the United States. I want to state them for you now and then expand during the first half of this talk to motivate these axioms. Axiom 1, constructivism. Constructivism. In regard to what the philosophers call the ontological status of race, which is basically, is there any such thing? I am a constructivist, which is to say I hold that the use of perceived physical markers to divide the field of human subjects into subgroups, popularly designated races, is a choice human beings make, a social convention if you will, for which no deeper biological justification is to be had. Furthermore, within a given society, this race-making is an historical product, often the consequence, perhaps unintended, of contention between interested parties. Race is better seen on this view as a socio-political than as a biological phenomenon, but it is no less real for that. That's my first axiom. Race is a conventional way of people relating to each other around the physical marks that we present when we encounter each other in society. Hair texture, skin color, bone structure of the face, and the rest. A convention, no deeper biological foundation, but nevertheless, conventional behaviors are real things in society. Okay? So right away, I want to dispel a confusion that the physical anthropologist and the population geneticist and so forth in their models can't give a taxonomic account of how the human field might be subdivided so as to give a consistent rule for creating population subgroups, and that's the case. They cannot do that, right? So in that sense, there are no races, right? Doesn't mean we need to stop talking about race when we have manifest in human behavior in societies all over the globe this kind of partitioning, preferential mating behavior, clustering of people in their patterns of affiliation and the rest, based on physical markers that they take to be meaningful. And more than that, we have individual human strivings and the strivings of communities infused with meaning and given purpose, understood for the humans themselves around these very markers. People understand themselves as raced. They tell an account of from whence they descend, in part in racial terms. Right? I mean, let me give here the analogy. It may be very hard along the Rhine River to decide what is German and what is French nationality in any objective physical way. Intermarriage, populations move, and all the rest along the France-German boundary. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as German nationalism, right? We understand that there is such a thing as German nationalism, very powerful force in the last couple of 100 years of European history. It would be foolhardy, wouldn't it, to ignore the power of nationalism in the interest of hoping that somehow there would be no more war, because after all, there was no objective foundational basis for deciding on family trees who was a German and who was a Frenchman. Right? That would be foolhardy. So too, I want to suggest with race. Axiom 2, anti-essentialism. In regard to the ultimate source of racial inequality, I'm an anti-essentialist. That is, I hold that widespread, durable, large-scale disparity in the social experience of different racial groups within the same society is itself a social product, not the result of systematically unequal innate human capacities as between the members of the racial groups. It's a social product. It's man-made. Okay? Permanent, large-scale, durable, deeply entrenched, profound disparities in economic and social circumstances of different population subgroups defined by race over a protracted period of time as an ongoing feature of the social and political organization of society is a product of society, not a natural given that we have to take as simply the way things are. That don't make it easy to change. That doesn't mean we understand all the deep underlying causal dynamics that create the product. Right? This is an axiom, not a conclusion on the basis of evidence. It's an assumption. I say, choose to look at the world this way. I say, organize our subsequent analytic undertaking on this foundation. I think this axiom can be defended on empirical grounds. I certainly think it can be defended on normative grounds. That is to say, we are a better people, a more noble people, to the extent that we would found our self-reflections about our social and political organization on such a ground. I say that. In any case, I advance it as an axiom. Axiom 3, racial stigma. The racial otherness of blacks is embedded in American social consciousness primarily as a result of the historical fact of chattel slavery. This inherited stigma, even today, exerts an inhibiting effect on the extent to which black Americans can realize their full human potential. Okay, that's clear enough. That's a couple of sentences. Racial stigma. This is not going to be a 400 years of racism harangue. Okay, so relax. okay? I'm not going to recount how many died in the Middle Passage, okay? And I'm not going to open up the archives of this or that plantation and tell you about this or that depredation. They're all there in the historical record. It's a fact. No, this is not the only transgression of humanity undertaken in a systematic and large social and political way by a society. We can recount others. We know that this is not the only. No, I'm not in the comparative victimology business here. Our suffering is greater than any other suffering. It can be proven by these or that arguments. That's not what I'm about. I'm about trying to understand the historical foundation for the contemporary socio-political order. From whence has it come? That's what I'm about. Okay, now I'll say this about that. At the end of the 18th century, there were some philosophical reflections that were the early buddings of what we now call political liberalism, rights of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were noble reflections, embodied in a government that came to be called the United States of America. We have a right to be proud of that, a beacon to the world indeed. The experiment was flawed at its inception by its necessity to compromise with what was actually an economic institution of the exploitation of human labor. It was called chattel slavery, the buying and selling of human beings as a matter of commerce. Again, I don't want to go off on a long aside on this, but I think it's just necessary to lay the foundation. Laws had to be enacted and administered to parse all the kinds of disputes that might arise associated with that commerce. Of course, we know about the ones having to do with those bodies having to get across a certain line on the ground that separates this state from that one. These are autonomous states. They can have different laws about slavery. The same body on that side of the line is a free man. On this side of the line, he's somebody's property. And the question is, to create a nation, federal, we have to decide how we're going to deal with that. Fugitive slave laws, the enforcement of them, and all the rest. Nation expands, there are new territories, they're going to come into the Union. What will be the dispensation under which they come? Will they be slave or free? That obviously has implications for the viability of the institution, because the institution has to go somewhere. There's a market here. You don't need to be a profound economist to see that if the territories in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and beyond come into the Union, free territories, that's not good for slave owners. Right. You get a civil war, so on. Or as Randall Robinson points out in this eloquent but I think flawed book of his that argues for reparations for blacks. I can tell you why I think it's flawed in due course, but I don't have time to lecture on that tonight. He says, let's look at the rotunda of the Capitol. Now we're in Washington, D.C. We're in this grand civic structure. We look up at this magnificent dome high up above grandeur. We're made to feel small by it. A great nation's government sits here. One knows. One looks at the mural painted on the ceiling. This is the United States of America. This is its seat of government. The Congress is sitting there. No African-American life depicted in the mural. How did those huge granite blocks get up there? Well, oxen and slaves hauled these big granite blocks from the quarry in Virginia, 100 miles up the road, to Washington, D.C., hoisted them up to their high place, and they sit there. Slaves who, if one of those granite blocks fell and the leg was crushed or the life snuffed out, there was an entire body of law about what recourse the owner of the property would have in the event of that loss of the property's value, and so on. Okay? Family life pretty much decimated by the intercession of the property interest of the owner between the natal relations of husband-wife, father-son, and the rest. Okay? In a country founded at the end of the 18th century, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, an account had to be given of how it is that such an institution of human degradation could be consistent with those ideals. And in short, that account was, these are not fully human beings that we deal with here. That's the only way. They had, at least tacitly and more often than not explicitly, to be understood as not quite fully human beings, lest the question would arise and could not be put to rest, how then can we treat them this way and still call ourselves a nation that loves freedom? Well, I say this about that. And Orlando Patterson, the great historical sociologist at Harvard, in his book, 1982 book, Slavery and Social Death, has said much better than I ever will. I say this: slavery, then, is not just the relation of property. It's not just ownership in human bodies. It is that, but it's not only that, because property relations can be abrogated by changing the rules of law. You can amend the Constitution. You can emancipate. Right? You can make it so that people are no longer property. You can refuse to enforce those contracts at law. Slavery was also a social system of racial domination, hierarchic ordering of society, and etching into the fabric of the nation's symbolic life of the hierarchic ranking of these persons. Right? And so it was possible for me, sitting in my hotel room watching AMC just the other morning, to see one of those early Shirley Temple movies come on the screen. This is 1932, 33 or 34, whatever. Okay, it's early. And there's a black character in the movie who is a buffoon. He's there for comic relief. He and the dog are there for comic relief. That's in this century. Again, this is not a harangue. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm talking about how profoundly deep was this symbolism of hierarchy, how taken for granted it was in the ordering of our nation's affairs. This might help us to understand how it was possible that as industrial capitalism was expanding at the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century, increasing profoundly the demands for labor, how it was possible that those factories could be manned by peasants from Southern and Eastern Europe who came in the tens of millions, and God loved them. While the American 5, 6, 7 generation-born peasants in the south of our own great nation could be kept at the social margin. How it was possible for there to be a race debate in the first decades of this century, when the question was, could the races of the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, and the Slavs be integrated into the nation of North Americans? That was the debate. That was the melting pot debate between 1890 and 1930 in this country. Right? While tens of millions of Americans, well, a good 10.5 million of them anyway, sat outside the debate, their race so profoundly other that the question of their place within the larger polity wouldn't even come up for another 25 years. Wouldn't come up, indeed, until we had defeated the Nazis, a racial regime, bid in a Cold War against an implacable communist foe to present ourselves as the leader of the free world, and then said, oops, well, I don't suppose we can do that and preside over a regime of apartheid at the same time, can we? Right? And only then, in the middle of this century, only then, in the middle of this century, do we begin to get that work started. Can it be any surprise then now, here we sit at the end of the century, that work's not done? That's all I say. The work's not done. Racial stigma. Now, let me try to motivate these axioms. I think I motivated the stigma axiom, so I may just skip over that text when I come to it. Okay, let me expand then on this axiom one. We're gonna build up a foundation here. Now, this question of what are we talking about when we use the word race is important because the sciences of modern biology and anthropology have established that there are no objective methods of taxonomy through which the set of human beings can be consistently partitioned into a relatively small number of mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive subsets that can be taken to constitute biological races. Genetic variability within so-called racial groups is almost as great as to be found within the whole of the human species. Primordial racial populations have intermarried to so great an extent that it's impossible to demarcate the boundaries between the races in a clean and scientifically useful way. So, while I'm going to be lecturing here about racial inequality, I want to emphasize that I don't understand the referent of the term race to be some tangible thing in the world. Rather, I take race to refer to, as I've said, a social convention, the practice of which is found virtually everywhere in social life, wherein people use the physical markers embedded in the bodies of human beings to divide the field of human subjects into groups. I don't think there's any deeper biological justification of race to be had, but I don't think none is needed for race, understood in this way, to be a powerful reality of the human condition. And as I've said, these racial conventions evolve in a specific historical context. So we want to attend to the context. And I've just said what that context is here in the United States of America. It was a different context at the southern tip of Africa in the late 19th and through to the middle of the 20th century, when race was also created on a national scale there, but with a very different context. And it certainly was a different context in South America, in the nation that we now call Brazil, where again, a raced society has come into existence, but the historical and social dynamics attending to that process of race creating were different yet again and peculiar to that situation. Right? Chattel slavery in a liberal democracy founded on late 18th century ideals. That's the foundation that I want to talk about for the race making that I'm concerned about here in the United States. Okay, so we got a field of human subjects characterized by morphological variability. What I mean to say is differences in skin color, hair texture, facial bone structure, and the rest. They come through concrete historical experiences to be partitioned into subgroups defined on the basis of some cluster of these physical markers. Now, information-hungry agents hang expectations around these markers. Beliefs that can, by processes that I'm going to discuss momentarily, become self-confirming. And meaning-hungry agents invest these markers with social and psychological significance. I want to stress here, when they do, they are not making a moral error. Okay? I just need to stop and say this. I'm standing up here as an economist, as a professor at Boston University, as an American citizen, and as an African American. Okay? You may notice that my voice rises from time to time. A little bit of passion may creep into what should be perhaps a dispassionate disquisition. It may occur to you that I actually care. In other words, this is not just an exercise. This is not a problem set. Right? Okay. Now, do I have a right to care about that? In other words, am I confused in caring about that? In other words, am I caring about the wrong stuff, attaching to a race when we all know that race is irrelevant? Why would I infuse that with meaning? Doesn't that just perpetuate the error of racism? That is such a superficial reflection on the human condition that I almost don't deign to respond to it. I almost don't deign to respond to it, but I'll respond to it this way. The great philosopher Leo Strauss, in a lecture to the Hillel at the University of Chicago in 1962, answered the question, why do we remain Jews? He had been asked, great philosopher, old sage, wise one, tell us. This way, in part, he said, that we not dishonor our fathers. In other words, we understand ourselves not just as beings at a point in time engaged in one-off transactions one with another in order to engender surplus. We understand ourselves as human agents who are a part of the flow of history and the web of culture. We infuse our lives with meaning. Human beings are meaning-hungry agents. They must find something transcendent in the artifacts that furnish their world. Okay? And so, these connections that are historical accidents take on larger significance to us. We create stories and myths around them. Some of those stories and myths get written down and become sacred text. And it can be the case that for millennia, people will understand their strivings in part in terms of these, if you will, arbitrary accidents of history. Okay. And that they do so only reflects the fact that they are human. And that in a racially hierarchic society, right, a person would do so in part in terms of race markers, the markers, arbitrary markings on the human body of no deeper significance in and of themselves, but play out 300 years of history, human striving, living and dying, hoping and praying, and you get something else, something that is thick and rich and textured. Right? So yeah, I understand myself as the descendant of slaves, among others. And yes, I see the story of my life and that of my children in part in terms of those folks that came up the IC Railroad to Chicago from the Mississippi Delta 90 years ago. Right. I don't have to make any apology about that. That's not anything new in human experience. The temptation to preach here is too great, and I'll yield to it just to this extent. Just to this extent. Okay? We got a race problem in America. Now, everybody knows that. Basically, you've got this kind of argument going on the right. Why don't you people stop thinking in those terms? Don't you know race is over? In other words, why don't I rewrite the story of what my family did in Stockyard, Chicago in the 1920s and 30s? Why don't I re-understand what happened when those folks went down the Mississippi in the 1960s and tried to do what they tried to do? Right? Why don't I just take that ghetto that I grew up in which everybody I knew until I was 15 years old was a black person, and rethink it because race is over? I mean, you would never tell the disputants on either side of a religious divide that the war would end tomorrow if one of you would stop worshiping those false gods. And yet African Americans are told today that they need to stop being, quote, obsessed, close quote, about what is in fact, at the sociological and anthropological level, an organizing principle of the founding of the nation that has shaped the experience of them and their forebears in profound ways. That they would infuse these arbitrary markers with meaning, that tears would come to their eyes when they hear the spiritual song that represent the hopes and strivings of their people over the generations, that they would hope that their children would go forward and do something for, quote, our people, close quote, that they would feel pride in the accomplishments and shame in the degradation of their own. This is not a mystery. This doesn't require explanation. It only requires explanation if the larger political context wants to sweep the problem under the rug and load the ethical burden onto the backs of the weakest people to carry it, right? If we want to stop being racist, then the polemical line would be, let white people give up the wages of whiteness. That would be the polemical line, but I'm here to give a serious lecture. I hope you see what I'm gesturing at, though, with that polemical comment. I hope you see what I'm gesturing at. What I'm gesturing at is that the historical, political, economic foundations of the country have been built around these arbitrary markers. Rents have been created, what economists would say. Rents have been created, okay? And they've been taken down. And they've been invested, and they've been rolled over, and they've been passed on across generations. Right? And so great metropolis like the city of Detroit, the Thomas Sugrue, profound historian, Bancroft Prize-winning book a couple of years ago, The Origin of the Urban Crisis, Race and Class in Post-War Detroit. He wants to understand where, if you like, Detroit came from. Now we know, you get to Detroit by the time Coleman Mayer becomes mayor of Detroit, and it's a mess. It's politics, it's economics, the city is a mess. It's going down the tubes. Population is plummeting, and the city core is bombed out. Crime, drugs, devil night rioting, et cetera, et cetera. So Detroit's a mess. Politics are a mess. Nasty central city versus suburban politics with a race man mayor playing the race card every chance he gets, right? So Sugrue, being a good historian, wants to understand where the city came from. You know, in other words, being a serious scholar of the history of American society, he's not content simply to engage in rhetorical argument and throw around names at people. Oh, these racists. They're black racists, that is to say. No, you know, so he wants to know something about what the auto industry was doing in the 1930s. He wants us to know something about how those Slavs reacted when the blacks started coming up from the South in the 1940s. You know, he wants to understand something about the politics of the city, about the economics of the city, about its geography, and about the role that race played in the making of Detroit. His bottom line is that race played a profound role in the making of Detroit. I would say to you now, if we want to understand Detroit, and of course Detroit just stands in here for a much larger frame, today it's going to be hard to do it right if we're going to abstract from the role that race has played in that history. Okay, the rest of this motivation of Axiom 1 told you about the role that information plays in the process that I'm talking about. Why it is that race can be not only a basis of people's strivings, as I've suggested here, not only a category through which one can understand the oppressive weight of history, as I've suggested, but it can also be instrumentally useful in many situations, and those processes can become self-fulfilling. Let me just illustrate that with one example. This is the taxi cab problem that everyone has heard about. A man like myself, wrong part of town, wrong time of day. Even if I'm dressed well, trying to get a taxi, the cabs won't stop for me because they think I'm going to rob them, or they think the probability that I'm going to rob them is sufficiently high that when they do the cost-benefit calculus, they as if, because, you know, they're cab drivers, they're not actually doing a cost-benefit, but, you know, then the bottom line is keep going. Now, I'm here to tell you I've got some sympathy for the cab driver. I mean, which one of us hasn't kept going, so to speak, under one or another circumstance. Right? In other words, you navigate the mean streets of any big city, you become shrewd, you become observant, you become streetwise, in Elijah Anderson's phrase. You get to learn what's going on, you weigh your costs and benefits, and you make prudent choices. Right? So if the gain is $10 from a fare, and the expected loss is $10,000 if the event occurs that this, let's just cash that out because you might lose your money, you might lose your life. So the average loss is 10,000. We got 10 versus 10,000. Obviously, the probabilities don't have to move very much before that decision flips. Okay? So he knows, as a matter of fact, that young black men are more likely to be robbers. Now, again, not all young black men are robbers. The numbers can be very small here. They can be like 3 in 1,000, something like that. And maybe other people who are not young black men on a street like that at a time like that, it's 3 in 10,000 or something like that. That's all it takes for that decision to be, you know, from an economic point of view, rational. But here's my point. My point is that if you are a young black man and you're going out at night and you know the cabs are not going to stop for you, if you are bent on doing no one any harm and you just want to get home, you'll probably take your car or take your T-pass, as we say up in Boston, or make some other provision. In other words, a process of adverse selection, we economists say, will go on here so that the relative frequency of the types of young black men who will elect that mode of transportation will endogenously, because of the cab driver's behavior, get weighted relatively more highly onto the types who might be up to no good. Right? Because the guys who are not up to no good know it's going to be very hard to get a cab. But a person who only needs one of them to stop to do what he needs to do and hasn't got anything else to do with his time might still go out there. That kind of thing. Well, you see, then the cab driver's behavior would have become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That they all started out thinking these were bad actors and behaved accordingly could have produced the very outcome that drove them, that caused them to think that way in the first place. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying I can explain the cab driver phenomenon with this model. What I'm saying is this little model that I just gave you can illustrate the thing that I am going to hang a lot on, which is that the superficial markers can come to be really informative. They can come to be really informative. I think if too many blacks move in, the neighborhood is going to go down. I sell my house as quickly as I can because I see the blacks coming. Well, you know, duh. Houses flood on the market, prices go down. People with lesser economic level can buy the houses. The triple-deckers start getting cut up into 3 separate apartments. The neighborhood goes down, right? So now everybody, when they see blacks coming, thinks, well, look what happened over on the other side of town. The neighborhood's going to go down. Let's get the heck out of here while we can. It can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. One can go on telling stories like this. The employer says these people tend not to work out. Now, Jose tends to work out. And when Jose brings me his cousin, they're hungry. They're not sullen. They're not going to pilfer the stocks. They don't have an attitude. They don't belong to a gang. They want to make it in America. But these guys from this housing project over here, they're all a bunch of bad actors. I haven't met one of them that really wants to work. Right. Now, I invite you to imagine what it might be like to be one of those guys from a housing project who might want to work, but who every time he encounters a work situation is dealing with an employer whose attitude is like that. He might say, as we used to say back in my neighborhood, pardon the expression, fuck it. I mean, that might be his attitude. You know, to heck with it. Let them go do whatever they're going to do. He may withdraw. He may indeed become sullen. He may become bitter. He may become alienated and angry. Okay, now we got sullen, alienated, withdrawn, angry people with a bad attitude that we're confronting. And if you're an employer setting up business and you see these people are sullen, alien, et cetera, you're going to say, I don't want to have much to do with them. That kind of process, too, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see where I'm going with this. So one of the reasons that race will become powerful in social life is that it can be informative. And that information can actually be objectively valid, even though the underlying structure doesn't admit of any deeper difference between the population groups. We don't have to assume any deeper difference in order to get pretty far down the line. And this is what I'm trying to do with this bit of economic theory here. I'm trying to just give you a glimpse of a larger argument that can be made about why it is that I can be an anti-essentialist and still be a social scientist. Right? In other words, I've got profound difference here. There's no doubt about that. Take a look at the criminal justice statistics. You know, these differences are big. We're talking almost an order of magnitude, differences in the rates of some of these behaviors. I got profound difference, but I'm still an anti-essentialist. I still want to say, basically, there's no difference in the capacities of these people. Well, I'm a social scientist, so I'm not just spouting rhetoric. Presumably, I have to have reasons for that. So this kind of theorizing about how these kinds of effects can get created and magnified, feed back on each other, create facts, which then justify behavior that creates more facts in the same direction, that's the kind of thinking that I'd want to draw on in order to justify my anti-essentialist position. Okay, I've already motivated the stigma axiom. I must tell you, though, I'm very profoundly influenced in this work on the question of stigma by Erving Goffman, a great sociologist, the late Erving Goffman. The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life is the book of his that many people know. Behavior in Public Places is another book. And he wrote a little book in 1963. It was published called Stigma, The Management of Spoiled Identity. And when I read that book 20 years ago, it really had a deep impact on me. And I always believed that the economics of discrimination, the subfield within economics, could be somehow illuminated by Goffman's idea about stigma, which I will simply tell you basically what Goffman says. Goffman says, okay, we encounter each other in society. And that was Goffman's great metaphor for social life, the encounter, the interaction situation, as he called it. We encounter each other in society. We see what we see. Here I stand before you. I'm relatively decently dressed. I appear to be sober. I was just introduced grandly. Evidently, I'm a distinguished academic. I have a good job, and so forth and so on. But it turns out that I'm a drug addict. That's possible. Not true about me, but it's possible. I'm a bigamist. Okay, I spent 3 months in a mental hospital as an inpatient, something like that. And in a different time, I'm a homosexual, closeted. Right? These facts, if revealed about me, would, let's just say, change your view of me. Okay? Now, there are two pieces of that. One is an information theoretic piece. As the Bayesian statisticians say, you would update your prior, which is to say, you had formed an estimate of who you were dealing with before on the basis of what you could see. Now you get new information, you form a new estimate. That part is straightforward. Goffman's after something deeper. You hold your expectations about me as normative demands. In other words, when I don't turn out to be who you think I was, you're profoundly disappointed in me. You're pissed off at me. You withdraw socially in a certain way. In other words, although the language is a bit hyperbolic here, the extent to which I am fully human in your eyes is diminished. You see, I become a cripple. Right? We don't use that word anymore. We've politically correctified our language. That's a word, though. We used to use that word all the time. A cripple. Right? In other words, I become marked. I become diminished in your eyes. Right? Now, of course, given that I have something that is discrediting that could be disclosed about me if it were true, of course, in fact, I don't. But hypothetically, if I did, I would want to manage that information so that you didn't learn it about me, and a dramatic tension would be created for my interaction with others in social life. And it's that tension that Goffman is working brilliantly in this little book as he tries to understand what the phenomenon of stigma, discreditability, and all the rest is about. Well, of course, that's not exactly what I'm talking about. But I want to take a social variant of that micro-sociological. I want to take a more macro-sociological variant of that, right? And basically, because of the limitations of time are what they are, and because I haven't yet made my normative argument about racial justice, I'm going to summarize on the fly what it is I'm trying to do with that. Basically, it's this. I say blacks are stigmatized in the society. No, I have not failed to notice that Oprah is making a lot of money, that people say I want to be like Mike when Michael Jordan was playing basketball and so forth. I haven't failed to notice that. And of course, let me just say more generally, I understand, if it needs to be said, that there have been really profound changes in American society, American culture, American politics and so forth around race questions. And the old style step and fetch it stuff that I was referring to from that Shirley Temple movie doesn't go down anymore. Doesn't go down. But I say this. I say we have 1.2 million African Americans under lock and key on a given day in the country today. Okay. Now, that's a few. That is a few. How is it that we manage to sleep at night, given what that actually means on the ground in so many places in this country? Brilliant series of articles written by a man named Jonathan Kaufman, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, based on Baltimore. Kaufman is based in Boston, but he did some interviewing in Baltimore. He shouldn't want a Pulitzer Prize for those articles, in my opinion. Goes into inner city Baltimore, and he basically wants to know, what is it about here in this community? And we're talking, I don't know, 100,000 people, 150,000 people. What's it basically about, these prisons? All these men swept off the streets, right? So he's got the stories, and I won't try to tell all the stories, but one of the stories is, grown woman with no man goes to the prison to find a pen pal to whom she can write, so she hopes she'll have a beau when this guy finally gets out of jail, right? Life organized around the Greystone buildings, organized around the business of processing human flesh, the physical control of human beings. Okay, now you would say they did the crime, they're doing the time. Lowery, you're a statistician, you ought to be doing some regressions to find out whether or not the sentencing probability is shorter or longer, conditional on race. And you know, there are smart people, Al Bloomstein and others, who've done that, and turns out that to the first order, pretty much, looks like the sentencing probabilities are not racially discriminatory, and it looks like pretty much the racial disproportion in prisons is because they've done the crime and they're doing the time. Of course, we could step back. Why did they do the crime? We would get into root cause stuff, long, drawn-out thing, and I don't want to go there. What I want to observe is this. Let's imagine, just bear with me for a moment, a comparable degree of devastation in the lives of Americans. Let's say young men on drinking binges driving their cars into trees. Let's say teenage girls in suburbia starving themselves to death so they can fit into that pair of jeans that are advertised in the New York Times Magazine. Okay. Bulimic, anorexic, whatever. Let's say gay men infecting themselves with the HIV and dying off in the tens of thousands, our sons, our brothers, before our very eyes. In which it could be said, paraphrasing, they did the crime, they're doing the time, which is to say, they engaged in behavior, the consequences of which they now reap. You reap what you sow. My thought experiment is this: would we not be riven at our very core at the human tragedy being played out before our eyes? Would we not be questioning not only what was wrong with them, but where had we gone astray? Would we not be examining our institutions and asking ourselves foundational questions about what manner of people are we that this should be playing itself out in our midst? Would our moralists not be unable to sleep at night? Right? I think the answer to those questions is absolutely yes. We wouldn't be able to bear it. It would not be enough to lay it off on their misdeeds because they are us. They are us. Those are our kids. Those tragedies are our tragedies. Right? We would own it, we would feel it, we would be riven to our core by it. We would struggle with it. Does that mean we would have an answer to it? No, not necessarily, but we would struggle with it. That hundreds of thousands of African American men can be swept into what Kenneth Clark once called as the dung heap of human debris. Can be tossed on the trash bin of history. Can simply be consigned to oblivion. Or, let me put it this way, that we can be in the business of when the town in upstate New York, downstate Illinois, western Pennsylvania, whatever, loses the factory, and there are no jobs, and the state legislature deigns to put the prison there after the committee with the heavy seniority representative lobbies to get it. And those men who might have had a job doing something else now have a job herding the cattle of those prisons, and those cattle are black from the big cities and brown, and those herders are white. This still being America, might we not want to reflect about what the nature of the business is that we are in doing that? Well, that no such reflection, except on the, I want to almost say far left, but you know, that is not a part of our politics and our public life and our public discourse. That is what I mean by racial stigma. Profoundly disparate social incidents can occur and occasion no deeper reflection about the structures of our society and our own mutual obligations to those persons, but instead tacitly be accounted for to us by an imputation of inadequacy of those people. That's what I mean by stigma. That we can engage in an open discussion about the extent to which their innate genetic capacities equip them to function in a modern technological society. Maybe they just don't have it. The data are not all in yet. Right? I'll try this one, just again in the service of illustrating my idea of stigma. So, the population is aging. I'm a baby boomer myself. Late baby boom, but I'm a baby boomer. The population is aging. Right? People are living longer, and the demographic curve, population is aging, okay? At the individual level, intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, over the course of the life cycle, peaks and then starts to fall off. Older people are not as swift. No offense intended. It's just a fact. You draw the curve. We just got through abrogating mandatory retirement laws as being discriminatory on the basis of age. You get it? Aging population, after a certain point you get dumber and you can't kick them off the job. Per force, as an arithmetic necessity from that source, the IQ of the workforce has got to be pushed down. The workforce ages, older people are not as swift, and we can't get rid of them on the job. Now, it may be lifted by other, our new immigrants from Asia and Latin America may lift the IQ, so maybe on the whole, there's the so-called Flynn effect, the secularly increase, so maybe we won't actually get dumber, absolutely, but the marginal contribution to our intellectual capacities as a nation from the aging of the baby boom is a negative. Just a demographic certainty. Where can I go and read about that? Consequences of that for American productivity. Well, of course, I can't read about it. Why? Because that's mom and dad, or in some cases, it's present company. I used to be able to do that hard stuff. It's getting harder to do. But you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is there would never be, or let me put it this way, there are regional differences in economic productivity in the United States and in economic well-being, right? South and the North. What's the difference in IQ between the average citizen of Tennessee and the average citizen of Massachusetts? It can probably be calculated from publicly available data sets, but I don't know anybody who's writing on it. I remain to be enlightened. Right? But we don't want to have a public discourse about the extent to which those dumb laggards up in the hill country of Tennessee or whatever are holding us back. Right? Because they're us. There is no boundary there. We understand that we sink or swim together. If it's dumb mom and dad, it's our dumb mom and dad. Just like if they were sick mom and dad, they'd be our sick mom and dad. Okay? Now, what I'm here to say is that that presumption can't be taken for granted by African Americans at the margins of society. Now, I would want to enrich this, if I had more time, with a class as well as a race-based argument, because this is obviously not something that would be categorically true across the board. But, let me just make you aware of the fact that I'm aware of that. Okay? But it's possible in our public life to talk about those people, not as if they were us, but as if they were them, a threatening, alien blot upon an otherwise more or less pristine American fabric. Right? What is this rhetoric about? I'm still talking about stigma. What is this rhetoric about? This rhetoric of, well, you see what the Cubans have done in Miami? On the shores of liberal democracy and industrial capitalism, they've built a great new world. That shows the vitality of our institutions. Oh, those blacks over there in Liberty City, the ones addicted to the welfare. Well, they riot every now and then, that's true. They're a bunch of laggards, that's true. But doesn't have anything to do with us. It's not about us. It's about them. So I'm here to suggest that it might also be about us. That when we look at those folks, we are seeing something that we have worked to create. No, I'm not about to resolve them of personal responsibility. I'm not about to make them into just chits on a board pushed around this way or that by historical forces. Of course they have responsibility for how they conduct their lives. I spent a good deal of the last 20 years saying just that to a bunch of people who didn't want to hear it. Of course they're responsible for how they conduct their lives. But at the end of the day, a 22-year-old woman with 3 children is only going to be able to do so much. Right? And although, again, I don't really have time to treat this adequately, I want to talk for a minute about the drug enforcement regime that we have brought into existence in the country. So here we are, the richest, most religious, and most hedonistic middle class on the globe. All three of those things are true. Okay? We got money to burn. We are puritanical as they get. Okay? And we also like to get high. What can I tell you? It's $100 billion a year commerce, drawing that coca up out of Bolivia and Peru, corrupting everything between there and here. There's not a government that it doesn't touch. Municipal government in the United States, national government in Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, the rest. The demand is creating its supply. Okay? Now that's America. That's not them. You can't lay that off on them. That's us, big time. Okay, now we decide the same middle class, the same religious, hedonistic, rich middle class that wants to get high decides that it wants to legislate against getting high. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to get off on a, we shouldn't illegalize drugs thing. That's just more than I can try to take on here tonight. I have my views about that. But we decide we're going to do that. So how do we do it? We balance the cultural budget on the back of the weakest people in the society. Is it any surprise that when you want to do the illicit thing that nobody's supposed to be doing, you go off to the margin, to the under-socialized community, to the bombed-out war front? Prostitution occurs by the docks, and drug sales take place in back alleys. And the people who do it are the people who can't find anything else better to do. Okay? Now you got $100 billion commerce driven by middle-class, middle American demands for escapism, molecules to excite their brains, okay? Carried on, because it's illegal, by marginal persons. We decide we don't like it, and what do? We criminalize a whole class of human beings, and then don't even have a discussion about it. That's evidence that those people are stigmatized. That's evidence that to the First Order, tacitly at least, their humanity is not being fully credited. They are not us. It's possible to shovel them over into the dustbin, put the top right on the can, and keep on moving. What's the justice in that? What's the justice in that? I mean, do this a thought experiment. Okay, there are buyers and there are sellers. Let's let the sellers walk, and let's put the buyers in prison for 10 years. Let's, to the extent that the Fourth Amendment permits, look under every every college dormitory bed. Let's find every lawyer, a stockbroker with a little bit of white powder on the mustache. Let's crash every high-priced nightclub up and down Manhattan to the extent that the Fourth Amendment permits, and let's lock them up and throw away the key, and let's let the sellers walk. Okay? Well, then the folks waiting online to get through the metal detectors to get into the Greystone buildings to visit their loved ones won't be from the housing projects. They'll be us. Okay? We might want to rethink the regime then, because the cost would be borne not by them, and because the implicit rationalization of this profoundly inegalitarian social policy could not be they're bad people reaping what they have sown. We'd have to reckon with the real complexity of the situation, and we might wake up and say, oh my God, as a society, we are engaged in a certain kind of hypocritical enterprise at a monumental scale, and we are loading the cost of it onto these poor sons of slaves and others, and it oughtn't to be so. Right? But because that boundary is there, because these people are not at the table, because they're not a part of our social cognition. I have a whole argument here that I can't exposit now about social cognition, about what stuff is salient. The way in which, this is just basic psychology now, the way in which you see is by contrast. The way in which you discern is by difference. What's salient? What's anomalous? What strikes our attention? What gets us thinking, oh my God, something must be wrong? Here, let me use this analogy. Gender differences. Hasn't always been so, but it is so today. You run a high school and all the girls end up at the bottom of the class. You run a science program and none of the girls can get into it. You do mathematics and the girls test way below. If that were so, everyone would say, oh my God, what's going on here? There must be something wrong. Not with them, but with us. We don't know what it is, but we won't rest until we find it, because we won't accept those disparate outcomes. Those disparate outcomes are ipso facto evidence of our failure. Right? But we can put a quarter of young black men in some communities under the physical control of the state and not even reflect on the extent to which what we do is not about them, but about us. No, I don't propose that we throw open the prison doors and let them go, and I don't propose necessarily that we repeal the drug laws. What I'm commenting upon here is the process of public reflection about inequality that is raced in a society that is racially hierarchic, that has a particular history, in which it is possible to not see something staring us in the face as blatantly obvious as this. Right? And that's going to raise questions of justice, so I guess I'd better start talking about that. Give me just a moment. Okay, you've come out to hear what I was going to say about racial justice. Let me tell you what I'm going to say. There are really two arguments about race and public morality in the United States. One of them is the color blindness argument. Race blindness. Race is an illusion. We just need to get over it. We shouldn't take it into account. Let's forget about it. The other one I'm going to call race egalitarianism. That's the one that says, given our history, disparate outcomes by race ought to occasion our attention and ought to be proactively addressed as best we can. There is a question about what is there to be done. I'm not unmindful of the fact that that's a question, but nothing's going to be done unless one wants to do something. That's when you start looking for an answer to the question. Race egalitarianism and race blindness. My justice argument here is that race blindness is the wrong way of framing the normative problem that is, this is great, but there's no place to put this after I take a sip. Race blindness is the wrong way to frame the problem. I am not a colorblind advocate anymore. Too simple by half. And yet, I still want to be able to affirm that there's a sense in which racial transcendence is the right moral reflex. Right? I put it this way. I've just got through saying it's a construction, no deeper biological justification to be had, a social convention, a human product. Therefore, we can unmake it in some sense. I mean, it's a human product. We don't have to be slaves to it. We don't have to worship at this idol. Right? So there's a sense in which I want to affirm racial transcendence as an ultimate ideal, and yet nevertheless argue against two-step liberalism, right, that reads John Stuart Mill and never gets beyond that to saying, oh, well, we shouldn't take anybody's race into account. Right? I call that two-step liberalism. Right? And I actually am an admirer of the Latin dance, and that's a little bit more complicated. I'm not against liberalism here. Okay, you know, let me go on and make my talk instead of cracking these jokes. Okay, let me begin the argument here. I'm going to ask you to think with me for a moment about a very formidable intellectual enterprise that's called social choice theory. Modern social choice theory, Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate, Kenneth Arrow, Nobel laureate. Some of you will, some of you, most of you will not have encountered these works. But in any case, there's this literature. It's at the junction of economics and philosophy. And it considers the formal logical derivation of implications for public decision-making that issue from various postulates chosen to capture our ethical intuitions about social justice. And a nearly universally imposed axiom in this literature, this formal literature, is the so-called anonymity axiom, anonymous, anonymity. What it means is this. It denies ethical legitimacy of distinguishing for purposes of social choice between two states of affairs that differ not in the actual pattern of outcomes for human beings, but just in the identities of the persons who suffer those outcomes. Okay, so if I had two situations, A and B, same number of sick people, same number of people in prison, same number of poor people, same number of uneducated people, and so forth in situation A as in situation B. But in situation A, it's one collection of human beings, and in situation B, it's another. The anonymity axiom forces me, as a social choice decider, to be indifferent between those two situations. No good reason to prefer one to the other. You see, this is a neutrality condition, because if I were to prefer one to the other, then perforce I would be preferring one set of human beings' welfare to another set of human beings' welfare, and we're supposed to treat all people equally in the social decision calculus. Okay? So now, suppose I argue for race egalitarianism, over and above egalitarianism as such. Then I've violated the anonymity axiom. What I'm saying is, it's a better society, not a perfect one, if there isn't so much racial inequality, even if there's the same amount of inequality. Now, how can that be defended? Okay? That's the question that I want to take on. How can that be defended? I don't mind arguing with the anonymity axiom. Quintessential icon of liberal political theory, this notion of neutrality. All individuals are to be treated as abstract embodiers of rights and not as any particularistic persons that we're going to have a special attachment to. I don't mind arguing with it, because it reveals how profoundly under-socialized is the entire intellectual project in which it's embedded. What I mean by under-socialized is that it's naive sociologically. It deals with human subjects in the abstract, detached from their actual location in the flow of history and the web of culture, detached from where they are in society. I'm not against liberalism as such, and I am not an ethnic cheerleader. Right? I'm not bean counting and trying to see whether or not my side has more beans than the other side, and then finding whatever clever arguments I can find to persuade whatever powers that be to give my side some more beans. I'm after social justice for all of us, rightly understood. And I simply say that right understanding can be arrived at by abstracting from the history and the social circumstance within which the individuals about whom we theorize are embedded. That's the claim. That's what I mean by liberalism being under-socialized. No simple-minded race utilitarianism from me, add up all the black people's utilities and then give that more weight in the social welfare calculus. That's not what I'm saying. But I do want our reflection about the rights of individuals and the vitality of institutions, the institutions that influence individual interactions, to take seriously the race historical and social structures within which those individuals function. Okay, now what about those raced historical structures? I've said a good deal about that already, but I want to just say this. Given the limitations of time and the fact that I tried to pack too much into this lecture, for which I apologize, I can't give you my whole argument. I'm going to have to try to summarize again. I say stigma, and I've told you what I mean by that. For decades, we have been saying discrimination. That is, we progressives. Can I do that myself? Can I be a progressive? We seekers of social justice have been saying discrimination. I'm down on discrimination for empirical and philosophical reasons. I think the empirical reasons are really pretty straightforward and not all that arguable. But I know I'm going to get an argument. Discrimination as a causal matter. By discrimination, what I mean is the good old-fashioned discrimination. I'm talking about you go to the job, you don't get the same pay, you don't have the same probability of promotion. You go to get the loan, they reject you where they would have accepted the other. Okay? You go to buy the house, they won't sell it to you, or they sell it at a higher price. I am not saying it doesn't happen. It happens. I know it happens. It's out there. There's plenty of evidence that discrimination happens. It's not as important a factor as it was 20 years ago, and certainly as it was 50 years ago, in accounting for the racial disparities that I need to account for if I'm going to be a consistent anti-essentialist. Right? You can't get there from here hunting for discrimination coefficients, is what I'm saying. So, look, I've got large-scale racial disparity. I'm an anti-essentialist. So I basically only have two arguments. One argument is people are presenting the same bundle of productive characteristics to the market, but they're being rewarded differently. The other argument is people who have the same inherent potential are presenting different bundles of productive characteristics to the market. I mean, that's just definitional. You got those two arguments. Call the first one reward bias. Their productivity is rewarded in a biased fashion by race. I just got through saying, while that certainly happens, it can't do enough of the work for us. It's a small part of the problem. It's there, but it's not the larger problem. The larger problem is I'm going to call development bias. On my axiom of basically the same inherent capacity, I nevertheless observe different degrees of development of that capacity presented to the market. development bias. Now you say, bias, Lowry, why do you call it bias? Right? Whereas someone shows up at the employer and the employer says, no, I won't hire you, but I will hire him, that's bias. But someone shows up in the world and he gets nurtured and develops his talent, and this one doesn't get nurtured and their talent doesn't develop. Why do you call that bias? Okay. I'm going to call it bias because I want to put as a matter of public responsibility the extent to which the avenues of human development are profoundly disparate, the opportunities for the realization of a person's potential as human beings are profoundly disparate by race. That's my major move. Now, if you're going to argue with me, this is where it's going to happen. Or this is where your most effective argument will lie, in my opinion. Right? How did I just make public a matter of what perhaps ought to be private? In other words, if the mother carries the infant and smokes cigarettes, we just know, as a matter of public health research, that the kid is going to be less swift on average. And if she drinks alcohol, that's going to be bad for the kid too. And if she does not verbalize to that kid while that kid is in the language learning critical months, that kid's language facility is not going to develop as well. We just know that. Okay? So now I've got a kid who was deprived almost from pre-birth of the opportunity to develop his or her full human potential by the behavior of her mother. Why did I call that development bias? Okay. Well, this is where I go back to my attack or criticism of liberalism as being profoundly under-socialized. Where did the mother come from? How did she come to be where she is? What's the structure of her life? What were her opportunities? What kind of community did she grow up in? What kind of education did she have? And what about her parents? Now, there's going to be variation in human society across these sort of things, but when there's systematic and profound differences as large as what one can observe across racial groups, and when you have a history of racial hierarchy, in other words, the north side of Philadelphia did not just spring up with the flowers this May. You know, it was a good 70 years in the making. West side of Chicago, same story. South Central LA didn't just get there. There were decisions that were made. That's structured social reality that conditions the making of human beings. Now, I'm confronted with those human beings and I find them, let me use a provocative word, misshapen, pathological, dangerous, deficient. They bear children and don't marry. They carry Mac 10s or Mac 11s and Glock 9s or whatever they are, and occasionally fire them off. Sometimes not even at each other. They score low, and darn it, we're going to be a state of standards. We're going to test our kids and make our schools accountable. They score low. What can I tell you? Right now I'm confronted with human beings who are in some way or another, from my point of view, inadequate. Inadequately developed. They had the potential, but the structure of their circumstance did not admit of their full development. Yes, I want to say that's bias. That's bias when it plays out on a large scale across hundreds of thousands, across tens of millions of human beings, when it becomes institutionalized, when it gets reproduced over the generations, when the fact of it gets etched into our political life, right? The unspoken but commonly understood reality of the situation is that we've got some of these people, and when a man as decent on these issues, I think, as William Jefferson Clinton needs to go back to Arkansas and preside over the execution of a mentally incompetent person who happened to have been an African American, but that really doesn't matter for my point here, although, of course, in a larger sense, it does matter. So as to show that he's strong on the death penalty, because no Democrat can get elected in America who goes around looking like Michael Dukakis. Right? I'm not trying to change the subject. What I'm saying is the symbolism, the political, taken for granted modes of communicating of where one stands and what one values, and the kinds of values that one has to propound into the public in order to be accepted as legitimate by the people. Right? And I'm saying that those things are tinged by, and sometimes more than tinged by, race. Anyway, reward bias, development bias. Basically, if I'm an anti-essentialist, I've got to choose between the two. And what I've said is I think reward bias, just as an empirical matter, won't do the work for us. But there's another point. Suppose I take development bias seriously. Suppose I think this stigma stuff is a real thing. Suppose when I see racially segregated communities, when I see, here's a statistic, Reynolds Farley, the sociologist, now at the Russell Sage Foundation, analyzes the censuses every 10 years, searching for various interesting patterns. He's been looking at intermarriage. He finds that over 70% of young Asian women who are married to white men. The number for black women, order of magnitude, 2%. Now, you can cut these numbers various ways, and black-white intermarriage has certainly gone up over time. But I am here to tell you that the barrier to intimate social intercourse between Asian American and Caucasian American persons is profoundly less high than it is between Caucasian American and African American persons. Was that an indictment? No. Am I pointing a finger at anybody? No. I'm just making an observation. Right? I'm going to make an observation about Americans who can go to China and Vietnam and Latin America to adopt children who are not white, and they have to fly over hundreds of thousands of orphaned black babies in order to do so. Is that the end of the story? No, because interracial adoption is a complicated issue in this country. And there are plenty of black people who don't like interracial adoption. I'm aware of that. Right? All this is about, when the geographers study the spatial patterns of the location of populations in the metropolises along the eastern seaboard, if you draw the map, and I've seen some of these maps, what you see are huge megalopolises, clusters of black people and seas of despair surrounded by the richest middle class on the globe. Anybody who lives in New York City knows that. I've been out walking around the city the last couple of days. Contrasts here are striking. I live up in Boston, a much more civilized place. Or perhaps what I mean to say in good Brahmin fashion, a much more staid and less dynamic place. But the contrast of wealth and poverty is what I'm getting at here. The contrast of wealth and poverty, the concentration of populations, the boundaries of the lack of social ties across those boundaries and so forth, isolated populations. Right, the playing out of racial stigma. So yeah, I'm going to call it development bias. I'm going to put it on the table for the public agenda. I'm going to say we shouldn't be able to sleep at night with this kind of stuff going on. Right? It's a public issue. What to do? Well, there can be a long list of discussions about what to do. Frankly, I'm not an expert about that, and that's not my subject. My subject is about the normative problem, not about the policy problem. Right? If you agree with me that there exists such a thing as racial justice, that it is a problem, and that we need to be busy about it because, in part, it's raced, I will have gotten a lot of the work done that I intended to get done here tonight. Right? Why am I against colorblindness? Well, I mean, let me distinguish between 3 domains on which we could have this discussion about raced public action. Okay? Now I will be getting around to talking a little bit about affirmative action, which I suppose many people have come to hear what I was going to say about. 3 domains. One is the domain of the implementation of policy. So we're admitting students, we are hiring firefighters, we are letting public contracts. Okay? That's the ground on which the affirmative action battle is typically fought. As Wirt Connolly has put it, let's get rid of those disgusting little boxes. We should be colorblind. Don't know anybody's race. If you don't have the box on the application, you obviously cannot discriminate in favor of the raced person. Okay? So at the level of implementation, we might go colorblind. We might make the decision without regard to the person's race. The second domain in which you might want to go colorblind is in the evaluation of alternative public undertakings. Now we are weighing in the balance whether we should do this or that. We calculate, or we at least in principle could calculate, what the consequences of doing this or that would be for various population groups, and we might want to take race into account at that level. The thing that we do well might be a colorblind thing. If we have a war on drugs, if we reform welfare, if we build a freeway down the middle of the city, all of these things are actions that can be taken without regard to anyone's race. They are not themselves, at the level of implementation, raced actions. And yet they might have profound consequences in terms of exacerbating or diminishing racial inequality. Let's say we're going to spend $10 billion over the next decade on our public institutions of higher education. Then we get to decide, do we plop it all down in one place and make it into an elite Harvard of the Midwest and recruit only people with SAT scores over 1,500? Or do we spread it out and orient our effort toward trying to educate people whose test scores are not so high by orienting ourselves to having a less elite-focused educational mission? Or some combination of the two, of course, and then there could be a scale. The choice about that will obviously have profound consequences for who's going to benefit from the enterprise by race. Can that be taken into account? Can the person who's making those decisions say, well, you know, we have a large population here of people who, if we do that, will not be able to benefit. We oughtn't to do that, in part because those are people who are a part of this group of historically disadvantaged by race. Okay? So on. That's at the level of the evaluation of policy. Okay? Third domain and final would be at the level of the construction of national community. Here we have a concern about the creating of the American people and the extent to which we would establish or diminish the boundaries and barriers between the American people, different groups of the American people. I know that that sounded awfully fuzzy, and I'm going to come back and try and make it more precise in a moment, but I want to go back to my first two domains because I reject colorblindness in both of those domains. I reject the position that we ought never to look into the boxes and take anybody's race into account when we take a public action. In fact, I think it's very easy to refute that position, which is not the same as saying that I therefore favor affirmative action in this or that venue. It may be a bad idea to do affirmative action in lots of venues. I'm talking about the question of principle. Should we, as a matter of principle, bind our hands and agree a priori that we will never look at any individual's race when we undertake a public action? I just think that's foolish. It's foolish. It would be foolish for the United States Army not to attend to the racial composition of its officer corps, because the legitimacy of the enterprise and its good functioning and morale could be profoundly undermined if they were to allow too large a gap in the racial composition of the enlisted personnel and the commanders to arise. And they know that, and they're taking actions on that. Right? Now, you might say, if those people would stop worrying about the color of their commanders, we wouldn't have a problem. And I will say to you, yeah, and if the Catholics would stop being Catholic, you wouldn't have Northern Ireland. In other words, I thought we were liberals and I thought we took individuals seriously. Those people, the grunts, who are going to get pissed off if they see that there are no blacks in the officer corps and they're out there dying in the ditch, understand themselves in part in racial terms. You can't just tell them to stop doing that. I mean, you can. But I don't think that level of argument is to be taken seriously. It's not a serious argument. That's not an argument. That is a piece of rhetoric meant to cover a political move. It's not an argument. And the fact that you can get black spokesmen to mouth those words don't make it an argument. Right? So the Army looks, and any governor who's going to appoint people to the bench in a state and has an attorney general that brings her a list of recommended appointees, all of whom are partners in the big firms and all of whom are WASPs or whatever, had better get a new attorney general. Right? I mean, the now legitimacy of the legal system is going to be in question if you don't pay attention to its diversity, its racial diversity, by way of sustaining its legitimacy. There's this argument. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals sits in New Orleans to handed down the Hobwood decision, outlawed affirmative action in Louisiana and Texas. Okay. I go to read the opinion. I mean, what do I know? I'm not a lawyer. I just figured I'd go read the opinion. So Judge Smith, who writes the opinion, says, oh, we can't have affirmative action, and the Bakke judgment is wrong because, well, you see, the diversity argument is parasitic on the assumption that your race determines how you think. You see, since a university is an intellectual enterprise, and the only kind of diversity that we should be interested in is diversity of ideas, to have racial diversity must mean implicitly you assume that black people think one way and whites another. That's a pernicious assumption. I agree with that. And therefore, we can't have the diversity argument. That's Judge Smith's opinion. To my mind, there's an obvious flaw in that argument. Okay, let me begin with Judge Smith and my conviction that there are no black and white ways of thinking. Suppose I want to actually get that across to my students. Suppose my students have taken notice of the fact that they have races. Okay? If I want the white students to know that not all blacks think alike, maybe it would be helpful to have some blacks in the classroom not thinking alike. Right? In other words, the pedagogic goal of teaching race transcendence might be abetted at the implementation at the administrative level by attending to the racial composition of the classroom. This is elementary. Right? I want to have a discussion in a case class. I'm going to teach from the case method. I want to have people coming out. I want to have something going on here. I might make use of the raced character of the human beings that I'm teaching in order to bring those issues more vividly to the fore. To the extent to which that's true in any particular pedagogic context is a matter of the judgment about the facts of that situation. It can't be resolved on principle a priori. It will matter sometimes and it will matter not. Judge Posner actually recognized that in a decision that he handed down, upholding the practice of affirmative action in what? The hiring of prison guards for boot camps in Illinois. In other words, we're going to bring the juvenile offenders downstate from Chicago, and we're going to have all-white prison guards while we're having out there marching from 6 a.m. in the morning until 11 o'clock at night in order to instill the fear of God in them so that they'll stay on the straight and narrow, right? And the state said, well, maybe it would be good if we had a couple of black drill sergeant type XGIs and a couple of guys who had, maybe had a little trouble and then straightened themselves up and got, to be there to help make this a viable enterprise, to instill in these young men the right kind of thinking about their lives. Maybe we'll do that more effectively if we have some African Americans. So we did a test, and the blacks didn't score that high on the test. So we skipped down, and we took a couple from down here so that we could put together a staff for this boot camp. And then we ended up in court, okay? And Judge Richard Posner, he's a conservative appellate court judge, a brilliant man in Chicago. He says, no, I think the Constitution will allow this. Right? And he's right, in my opinion. Constitution can allow that. We don't have to fall on our sword here. The barbarians will not be at the gate. America will not be run aground if you skip down the list a little bit and you hire some black prison guards to the boot camp. Right? Let me raise the stakes. So these fine gentlemen who run these multi-billion-dollar philanthropies, one of them's down the road a bit south of here, one of them's across the river from where I live, Princeton and Harvard. I'm talking about the shape of the river. I'm talking about William Bowen and Derek Bach. Okay, elitist. We sneer until our kid gets a chance to join this elite cadre. Right? So they write a book and they say what? They say, we're in the business of constructing the folk who are going to run this country. Between the lines, that's pretty much what they say. That's what we're about. We did our regressions. Our graduates make a lot more than everybody else's graduates. They end up running the country. It occurs to us as we exercise our charge as stewards over these multi-billion-dollar, august, centuries-old institutions that are at the core of the foundation of the American establishment, that we might usher in a few matriculants from the African-American population subgroup in order to see that these elites that we're helping to construct are a little bit more diverse. That's all they say. That's all they say. And we can have some technical argument about whether they prove this or that in the book, but basically, that's all they say. And they say, yeah, we did that, and we checked our numbers on the survey, and it turns out it's working. We are, in fact, ushering in a few more African Americans. Look at these are private philanthropies, tax exempt to be sure. Princeton, Harvard. But they're private philanthropies, just like the MacArthur Foundation is a private philanthropy, okay? Bill Gates Foundation. They're giving away money for public good. Now, if somebody sets out to say, here's a disease that's striking down hundreds of thousands of African Americans, and we're going to devote our private philanthropy to solving that, would anybody be running around saying, you're not colorblind? No. They would say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. So these gentlemen say, we're constructing the elites that are going to run America, and we want to see some black people in there here at the end of the 20th century. Have they said anything controversial? Not in my opinion. They've said an incredibly modest thing. Incredibly modest. You have to know the numbers here. Okay? You're the typical applicant, and there's a lot of self-selection. You don't apply to Harvard if you know you're not going to get in. You got a 0.25 probability of being admitted. You got tons of people with 1,600 board scores who are rejected at Harvard, Princeton, and like institutions. Okay? Get rid of all the affirmative action at Harvard, Princeton, and like institutions. The probability rises from 0.25 to 0.27 for your self-selected white applicant. Let me just translate that. 75 people get rejection letters. 73 of them are still going to get rejection letters if you get rid of all the affirmative action in the world. Right? America is not being run aground here. Now, you can argue whether Bill Gates is spending his money well or poorly, whether the MacArthur Foundation ought to get rid of those stupid genius awards, or give me one of them. You can argue with Princeton and Harvard's understanding of what their missions are. Those things can be argued with, to be sure. but that some high principle of merit has been trashed by what they do? You know, that something of foundational significance is at stake here, I think tells us more about America than a lot of things I've heard lately, right? You have to see the text, you have to read the subtext. This is not about what it looks to be about, in my opinion. This is ultimately not about discrimination against whites and on behalf of blacks at all. It's about whether the race egalitarian mission that those gentlemen are prepared to make explicit, we're constructing elites here and we're going to see that blacks are a part of it, is a legitimate enterprise in America. That's what it's about. I insist to you, given our history, that it should be understood as a legitimate enterprise, that that race egalitarian mission should be understood as a legitimate undertaking. We may quibble about how it's advanced, but that it would be advanced, it seems to me, is the burden of the argument that I've tried to make here. We oughtn't still to be arguing about. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
2 minutes of questions.
Yeah.
We have time for a few questions, please.
I'm fielding the questions then?
You're feeling the question.
Okay. Michael Myers.
I have the so what question, a variant thereof. If what you say is correct, and I think historically you're absolutely correct, there is vast racial disparity. There is one author called an overdeveloped white community and underdeveloped black community. If we're talking about justice, what do you do about that? If it's not reparations, you know, if affirmative action is modest, if not adequate, if too many groups are in affirmative action, if groups are in affirmative action that don't have that historical disadvantage as blacks have, what do you do about the vast racial disparity? If the neighborhoods and the suburbs are privileged and white because of discrimination or history or stigma, and nobody's given up anything, nobody who would consider themselves to be innocent because they are the descendants of the rich and wealthy or the slave masters, but they don't feel guilty about that. What are you going to do about that? Is it going to be a redistribution of land? Is it going to be...
Okay, I've got your question, Mike.
Okay.
Look, the short answer is that that's not just my question to answer, okay? As I said here during the talk, I know that there are questions on the table of what do we do, questions about policy, and I don't know the answers to all of those questions, right? My level of argument is at a different level. It's a level that says what should go into attempting to answer those questions and whether a concern about racial inequality has a legitimate place there. So I'm not trying to beg off here, and I'm going to get to that, but I want to say that first, right? If you buy that, right, if you find that persuasive, if America were to find that persuasive, I would have done my job, right? Okay. But now, let's talk about what do you do. Schools, okay? So now, development bias. Lowry says development bias. He says human beings have the basically same capacities. Now, there are variations on individual level, but groups, large groups of people, we oughtn't to assume any basic differences. And yet, we see such very vast differences in outcomes. Now, we know part of what's going on here. And in fact, we know quite a bit about what's going on here. We know that the school is 6 hours a day, and the family is 18 hours a day. We know that profound disadvantage, chaotic lives, ghetto communities, violence, disorganization, right, makes it very difficult to develop what the economists call the human capital of these human beings through these 6 hour a day, 5 day a week, 40 week a year enterprises. Right? So now, we've got a movement for equality, race egalitarianism in schooling. Part of that was integration. Okay, now we know where that's come to. Right? Basically, integration has run into the fact that people can move, right? And that in the land of the free and the home of the brave, and I mean no irony there, we're going to put a bound on the extent to which we're prepared to intervene in order to counteract that effect. I don't say there's nothing that can be done here, and there are good people spending a lot of energy trying to do something, but ultimately I feel that they're playing at the margins if the issue is going to be, we got to get black kids and white kids into the same classrooms together, poor inner city black kids and white kids sitting next to each other in the same classrooms. Whether as a social science matter that would do a lot for the human capital of black kids, I don't know. I'm not really qualified to answer. But as a political feasibility matter, I don't know if it's going to happen. But here, how about this one? Why doesn't the definition of equalization, in effect, be a hedonic, what we economists call, where you equalize not dollars spent, but you equalize the impact of the public monies that are provided, right? So if I have a set of people who are disadvantaged by family background considerations, I got to spend more public money in order to create the same equal opportunity. Maybe it's 3 times more. Maybe it's 5 times more. Okay? Maybe money won't do it. Okay? Maybe the production function of human capital tops out on money, and after a certain point, you're just not going to get any more bang for the buck. If that's so, then I'll have to live with that, right? But imagine what equality of educational opportunity would mean if it were approached from that point of view. Right? It would presumably be a very different enterprise. Let's talk about these jails, bro. Let's talk about the prisons. Let's talk about, I am moved by this. I must say, I'm moved by this. When I began to look at these numbers, I was stunned. I was stunned at what's gone on in America in the last 20 years. We've had a profound revolution in policy in the United States in the last 20 years. Prisons are the way in which we deal with poor men in this country. They are the social program for men in this country. They don't work, right? The guy comes out, he doesn't have any more human capital than when he went in, except as it would apply to some activities that we would rather him not engage in. They are hellish places. I know because I've been in them. I serve on the board of the Prison Fellowship Ministries. That's Charles Colson and company. It's a Christian ministry that tries to work inside of prisons. I've been in a lot of prisons. They are hellish places. Okay? Now, there's no way around race here, right? Half the people in prison are black. Blacks are 1/10 of the population. These numbers have quadrupled in the last 2 decades. This is major, major business in the state legislatures of the 50 states around the country. We're talking serious business here. Okay? So the country's engaged willy-nilly in a social program that's mucking around in the lives of many hundreds of thousands of prime-age African-American males. Okay? And it is doing no good. It needs to be reformed. No, I don't suggest that we fling open the gates. Yes, I'm aware of the fact that when people violate their neighbors, they have to be punished. I know that too. But I think that if you began with the philosophical foundation that I've laid out here, your penology would look a little bit different than what's passing for that subject right now. I think that if you went to reform welfare and so on, you see how it would go? I would take each one of these areas and I would race it in the sense that I would think in part in terms of the consequence of what I do for racial inequality. One last one, I know there are other hands up. We got something called the death penalty in this country. Some people think it's a bad thing on moral grounds. Some people think it's discriminatory, although they're having a hard time finding those discrimination coefficients in the data. They're now reduced to the argument that, I know I'm going to get an argument on this, but I've been reading the literature, this is what I see. They're now reduced to the argument that, well, the probability that you get executed depends on the race of the victim. And the victims are white, you're more likely to get executed than black. Okay. Here's a new argument, I think, about why the death penalty is a bad idea and why race would be a part of the determination that it's a bad idea. The argument goes like following. Look at, we're going to have the public extirpation of human life undertaken by the state as an official act. Sacred ground. The suckers are swinging from trees. That's the metaphor. We're going to kill them. We're going to fry them. Vengeance. We're taking human life. The state, the American people, the people of New York State, the people of Massachusetts. We don't do that in Massachusetts. I guess you don't do it in New York either. Are taking, or do you? Okay, now you do. We're going to take human life. Reporters are going to be in the room, the whole 9 yards. Okay? Sacred ground. Civic pedagogy. Projecting images, teaching us who we are as a people. I think the execution of human beings undertaken by the state as an official act of government is a very serious enterprise. Let me set to the side the moral arguments. Let me say it's not cruel and unusual punishment. I just want to bracket that. Now let's just talk as a matter of policy about what we do. We're taking human life. It's a public demonstration, a great drama, Greek tragic proportion. Okay? That it would be done vastly disproportionately on African American men. You might want to say that's not what we want in America. You might want to say that etches the line of stigma every bit so much deeper. Right? If I really believed in colorblindness, right? If I really were trying to construct a polity in which racial division was less significant, I wouldn't start at the bottom with the little boxes that people check on the census. I would start at the top with the most profound meaning-creating images that we project into our public life. Okay? And executing human beings is one such. See, that would be a very different argument. You couldn't have made that argument, at least I couldn't have made it, without some such development of the sort that I've been advancing here. Right? So I'm working at a higher level than the level of parsing out policy and making recommendations for statutes that would be passed by a state legislature, but I'm hoping that the level at which I work could nevertheless be useful in informing something like that. Okay, this gentleman in the back.
Yeah, race egalitarianism, and that's an equality of outcomes. You would like to focus on equality of outcomes, and that's race egalitarianism. But it's not when we're comparing a kid from Scarsdale to a bad neighborhood in New York, right? We're really comparing two kids who live next to each other in a bad neighborhood in New York. One gets into blue college and does great. The other one doesn't. Now, what policies are going to make the other one get to blue college? They both look identical, their families are identical. It's not Scarsdale bad neighborhood, it's two kids next door to each other. Same lousy house, same kind of disadvantaged families. And it's not a trivial proportion that gets to blue college and do fine. It's a very significant proportion. So what, it's not, spending, and I think the American public would buy into it, and I'm very supportive of the idea if you could give them a program that'll make both of those two kids get to blue college. So that's the question.
Well, no, I don't have that program, but I take it what you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, well, okay, we've got a lot of people with low incomes in this country, but some of them are doing very much better than others with respect to being able to get into places like Baruch. Some of them are really more able to mobilize and move up the ladder. And to a certain degree, that's going to vary by ethnicity. Right? Some of those people are going to be relatively recent immigrants to the country. And indeed, some of them are going to be black people who are relatively recent immigrants to the country. But they may not be African Americans of many generations of being in the country. How can I draw a distinction between those people, you may ask me. Now, I don't say that Baruch, I don't know anything enough about Baruch College to comment on your admissions policies here. So I'm not commenting on the college's admissions policies. I don't know what your admissions policies are. I think, though, that if I were in charge here, and I looked around and I didn't find any or very many African American students in my ranks, I would regard that as a problem of the first order, and I would move to do something about it. Okay? I think, yes, the institution serves the city, and the city is diverse. Okay? The city is a city of the realization of opportunity, as was said so eloquently by Mrs. Engelman at the beginning. And so that the college would understand its mission in substantial part in facilitating the incorporation into the American structure of opportunity of new arrivals to our shores, many of whom will not be from Europe, most of whom, the vast majority of whom will not be, would be a good thing. But I would say, as I said at the very outset of my talk here today, my claim is American society has unfinished business. We're seeing some of that unfinished business played out in the lives of some of these folks who are African American living in the city of New York who are not gaining admissions to Baruch. And to the extent that it's possible, you may tell me we've tried everything, we tried everything, we tried everything. To the extent that it's possible, it seems to me that I would credit that among the other things that one is trying to do here. And yeah, sometimes what that's going to play out is in the following way. This is inescapable. It's going to play out that here's this kid and here's that kid. This kid got a break, that kid didn't get it. They were both close to the line. This kid got the break and that kid didn't get it because we had a mission of something that we were trying to do here and we favored that kid. Make no bones about it. Make no bones about it. If you practice affirmative action, you're going to be favoring somebody. Okay? Yeah, sometimes it would play out like that. I think that's the way of the world. As I say, with respect to those guys at these elite institutions, not Baruch, that they do a pretty modest thing when they say, as we create the elites who will run this country, we're going to make sure there's some African Americans among them. I think it's a relatively modest thing to say to a university like this that as you create the elites who are going to run the city, one of the things that you can do is see that there's some African Americans among them. Robert Cherry.
One of the things you didn't mention is sort of the 25 years at which, from the early 70s to the late 90s, where in the worst year, the white unemployment rate was not as high as in the best year for blacks. And it certainly is another example that whites would never accept those unemployment rates regardless. But we are now in sort of a situation where labor markets have gotten really tight. To what extent do you think sustained tight labor markets as we have today may rectify some of the problem? Or would you put it with anti-discrimination law where it'll help a little, but it's not going to really be that corrective?
No, I think that's a terrific question. I really appreciate it. And you're probably better qualified to answer that question than me, but let me just say this, because I know you've worked on this. It's major. It ain't all about employment, right? It's about inflation, and it's about the market. It's about the return on equity. It's about the stability of the money, right? And the reason the Federal Reserve is an independent, autonomous agency is so it can make the hard call and induce a recession when necessary. Let's not mince words. That's what we're talking about. And when that happens, if American history economic history tells us anything, it tells us that the black unemployment rate is going to shoot up at twice the rate that the white unemployment rate is going to shoot up. That's what we've seen in the past. That would be too bad, but I think it's probably inevitable. And I am not a person given to forecasting, but this is one that I think I'm on pretty good ground saying. It's probably inevitable that the overheating, tight labor market economy will need to be checked by the guy that controls the money. And when that happens, we're going to... Now, here's an interesting question. Let's suppose that we were to model that decision, right? So the guy's got to decide when to do the thing. Okay? Now, there's cost and benefits everywhere, so we've got a complicated model. Ought the racial inequality factor be among those costs and benefits? See, I say yeah. So that might lead us to move a little bit out on the margin, risk a little bit more inflation, delay the onset of the intervention a little bit longer, right, at the margin. I say, yeah. Now, I find that intellectually interesting, right? Because that's not the affirmative action that most people think about, right? That's at my level, not of the implementation of policy, but of the evaluation of alternative policies, taking the racial incidence into account. I can think of few venues in which the racial incidence of policy would be more important for the bottom lines that I've been talking about here today than that very one. And while just like anybody with a lot of money in securities, I don't want to see the money trashed. I mean, I'm grateful for the prudent management of the fiscal affairs of our country. I am, and my children and grandchildren are betting on it. I'm serious. Come on, I mean, we know what's happened around the world. That can't happen in America. And I'm not being facetious here, I mean that. Even so, a delay, a marginal call one way or the other, I think it could make a difference, and I think it ought to be factored into account. But that's an important question. This is the last question. It's the gentleman in the back row who's had his hand up for a while.
Yeah. On the affirmative action issue, what is your response to the notion that if you alter the structure, and I understand the argument that we're going to have a few more blacks in the elites, but by altering the structure, don't you make yourself, or other people, not just yourselves, make everybody vulnerable to later on that same alteration could be used to discriminate against people, not to help people? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I say it's responded to properly would be it's a deep question. Okay. The geographic diversity rationale that the Ivies discovered when too many Jews started applying with high test scores, and they decided that they needed to preserve the character of their institutions against these people from New York City and other places, and so they discovered that they didn't want to have too much geographic concentration of people from any one place. That's a fact about American history circa, I don't know, 19, 20, 30, 40. Fact. No getting around that. Okay, that's fact. Now, let me just, pardon? No.
Disenfranchising certain groups, say Jews, for example.
I'm trying to respond. So I'm looking at early 20th and mid-20th century American history, and I'm saying the Ivies discriminated against Jews in effect by retreating from meritocracy to the extent that they did, and it was covered with arguments about geographic diversity. So I just made that observation. Now I want to shift gears. I want to move to the late 1970s and the early and mid-1980s, and I want to talk about the impact of affirmative action on Asians. Okay? When universities were deciding that they wanted to have more blacks, but they didn't want to admit any fewer whites, and so they began to discriminate against Asians. Clear documentation of this, actually a very good book on this written by a sociologist, Dana Takagi. In any case, once that was brought to light, that stuff went by the boards immediately. Right? In other words, the ability to sustain an admissions regime that would be discriminatory against Asian Americans, rationalized by whatever, was unable to withstand any scrutiny whatsoever. Right? That leads me to say the following thing. We're a different country in 1980 than we were in 1930. Right? So that as a pragmatic judgment, not as a principled matter, because I grant the point that in principle, one might make all kinds of rationales for all kinds of things. As a pragmatic judgment, do I think I'm going to see universities in the United States endeavoring to discriminate against vulnerable or marginal groups of people, using as a cover the fact that they took race into account in order to promote race egalitarianism? I don't think we, as a practical matter, need to worry about that, although I'm happy to be, persuaded otherwise. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.